Hello and welcome to another episode of the Breachside Broadcast, home of the finest voxcasting either side of the breach. The Burning Man changed everything about Malifaux. His arrival wreaked terrible destruction upon the world. He is a force to be feared, but such power naturally attracts those seeking power. The factions of Malifaux are racing to research the Burning Man. But even reading about him can be dangerous. I hope you enjoy part 3 of Madness of Malifaux, right after this word from our sponsor.
This episode of the Breachside Broadcast is brought to you by Taihan's Noodle Kingdom. Located in the heart of the little kingdom, Taihan's is the perfect place to enjoy a bowl of udon noodles, a pot of tea, and a clandestine conversation about the latest conflict between the Ten Thunders and the Guild. Our miso soup is truly heaven in a bowl.
Nellie wiped her hand across her forehead, smearing it with a long line of grease. The printing presses thrummed, filling the dilapidated warehouse with heat as they put ink to paper. Loyal followers bound the books, then newsies wrapped them up in cord. Nellie ran a finger across stacks of finished volumes of the Flamme. She knew the words by heart. They were always the same. But the journalist couldn't help herself. Nellie grabbed a copy and flipped to the first page. Just one more read-through. The sun rose over a broken land. Spires of black stone poked through the sun-blasted sand. The only interruptions to dunes that stretched from horizon to horizon. Even at first light, the air shimmered with heat mirages, and the sand underfoot scorched the flesh. The only sound was the whisper of sand sliding across sand, and the moan of furnace-hot winds scouring the air. This waste had once been a city. Where ridges of jagged rock stood, walls had once risen, crowned with towering spires. 1,000,000 souls had made their home here, filling its streets with life and its workshops with the clamor of machines and magic. The air had hummed with the music of creation. It had been a great city, unlike any other, and its people had been scientists, creators, and artists unrivaled in the world of the Fae. They were known as the Aua. And then, in the blink of an eye, this place of art and life and industry had been destroyed, burned clean by the fury of Cherufe's madness, an example to those who dared stand up to his power. The Aua died, and those few who survived fled into the wastes to escape the flames of Cherufe's vengeance. His last spiteful blow cursed them with a disease of ash and cinder, burning from their bones and consuming their flesh. This was only a memory in Tiri's mind. Flames and death and flight. Dreams from a childhood nearly forgotten. Her entire life had been spent in the burning wastes, where the heat of the sun seemed to tame the mad tyrant's curse. She never thought her people would return to this place. But then Cherufe returned, and the burning in the bones of the Aua returned with him. Nothing they tried could stop the agony, and so the elders met and decided that something had to be done. Cherufe had to be stopped, or the Aua would perish. Perhaps we shouldn't have come back, Tiri whispered to herself. She lay a hand on the rough surface of the rock that would serve as Tene's headstone. They had buried so many on their journey, graves claimed by the sands and erased from memory, unremarkable except for the ashes they held. Perhaps we should have stayed away. They are waiting. Danoke, Tiri's personal guard stood a dozen steps away, his face hidden behind the geometric patterns of his helm, but his voice was laced with sadness. Tane had been like a father to him, to them both. Tiri nodded briskly and turned back to the ritual of burial. The gathered Aua stood in the loose circle around the hole in the ground that would contain what little remained of Tane, once they were done with him. They were tall and slender, blue-grey skin masked by draping silks and loose garments the color of gold and stone. Bony ridges crowned the heads of the older Aua, decorated with medallions of metal and painted wood. The music that moved through their bones drifted through the air. A few of the Aua showed signs of enhancement beneath their clothes, or burrowing across their flesh. They were all much older than Tiri, though she held the elder staff. The young were elsewhere, busy preparing the caravan to move. Mourning was for the old. Tiri didn't blame them. She would rather be elsewhere as well. Tane's body waited on a sheet of rough cloth, naked save the dozens of prosthetic implants that had kept the elder alive for so long. It was less dignity than he deserved, but all that the Aua could manage in this thrice-cursed place. At Tiri's signal, the alchemists descended on the corpse, chanting their incantations of unbinding and reclamation. Their knives cut Tane's skin, carefully extracting the mechanical enhancements and placing them in containment tanks. Small geysers of ash and steam hissed up from the corpse. Chirufe's curse had claimed much of the old Aua, and now it would take the rest of him. When they were done with their grim task, the alchemists stepped back and bowed their heads. Tane lay open on the sheet. There was no blood. Instead, the open wounds cut by the alchemist's knives crumbled slowly into ash. His chest collapsed in a swirl of bright cinders, quickly followed by the hollow shell of his skull. The small crowd of Aua muttered amongst themselves. All knew the fate of their people, ever since Chirufe had damned them for their role in his imprisonment, but it was still a difficult thing to see. When the curse of cinders had run its course, there was nothing left of Tane but a thin line of ash, outlined by scorch marks and the smell of burning dust. At Tiri's nod, the alchemist priests gathered the ash into the sheet, folded it solemnly, and placed it into the grave. Tiri laid the first handful of dirt herself, then left the others to pay their respects. She had work to do. Demok fell in line behind her. His impassive mask turned sharply away from Tane's grave. "See that Tane's prosthetics are reclaimed and redistributed," she ordered. Denok nodded, but did not otherwise answer. He was a good leader, Denok. This is what he would have wanted. "An unmarked grave in a dead city?" Denok asked. If we had stayed home, we would all share his fate," Tiri said. "It has been weeks since his spirit has been felt," Denok said. "Perhaps he has been contained again. Perhaps the cage has been rebuilt and his soul bound. The presence we felt was not fully Chirufe." Tyr drew to a halt and turned on Denok. The guard faltered, then fell into a stance of strict obedience, head tilted slightly toward the sky. "Look at me," Tiri said quietly. After a heartbeat, Denok shifted his gaze. "Take off your mask." "My lady, it is not. Take off your mask," she repeated. Hesitantly, Denok fumbled with a clasp that kept his face covered. The steel and brass contraption hissed as it disentangled itself from his skin, filling the air once again with the smell of burning dust that had hung over Tane's corpse. Even though she was expecting it, Tiri's breath caught in her throat. An open wound ran from Denok's forehead, across his left eye, and down to his throat. The flesh lay in layers of crumbling ash, like wood burning into charcoal, the deepest crevice of the stone pulsing a deep, angry red. The curse had claimed his eye. He had replaced it with an orb of steel and glass that whined when he turned to look at her. "It's getting worse," she said. Denhook didn't answer. "Have you spoken to the alchemists?" "What will they say? I'm still fit for duty, if that's your worry. I will die at your side, of this or something else. I have sworn it." "Denhook, you can—" Her voice trailed off. "You can trust me. We are doing the right thing. We must do this." "I pray you are correct." He settled the helm back onto his head, hammering the clasps home and reconnecting the tubes that slowed the curse's growth. "I must see to the Elder's remains. Is there anything else you would have me do?" "Trust me. Believe in me. Tell me what I have to do to gain your faith." But instead of saying any of this, Tiri shook her head. Her old friend bowed once, then marched briskly back to the grave. Tiri turned and drifted through the camp, thinking. The camp was an uneven mix of high technology and drifter's caravan. Alchemy labs burbled in the lee of sun-bleached tents, and broken-down wagons trundled behind biomechanical pack animals. The Aua who sat huddled around the metal braziers at the mouth of each tent complex were just as diverse. For the most part, the younger Aua still held their natural forms, tall and slender, with backbent legs and sharp teeth. Among the older generations, those whose memories ran back to the days before Cherufe's betrayal and curse, alchemical modifications became more prominent. As the curse of ash took them, they'd been forced to augment themselves just to survive. Those early experiments and prosthetics led to some Aua implanting technology in their bodies purely for function, to make themselves faster or stronger. The wastes were a dangerous place, and the Aua few and desperate. Tiri found herself in front of the tent of the elders. Once home to the whole circle of wise ones who led the Aua, now it stood mostly empty. Tiri hesitated at the mouth of the tent. She still felt like an outsider here, despite the staff of office she carried, despite being raised in the shadow of authority her entire life. The elders had selected her. The people had affirmed her. She was being foolish. Setting her shoulders back, Tiri brushed the curtain away and stepped inside. The smell of death nearly strangled her. Not violent death, not blood and offal and the sweat stink of murder. This was the smell of slow death, patient death, inevitable death, waiting in the shadows and counting your heartbeats down to zero. Censers hung from the low ceiling of the tent, wafting the air with incense, trying to mask the stench of decay. Crystalline chimes, attuned to the music that flowed through the soul of every Aua, whispered in the darkness. The only light came from a scattering of candles at the foot of a bed in the center of the room, and the dim glow from a dozen machines that crowded the mattress. The slow in and out of ragged breath synced up with the rise and fall of pistons. Tiri steeled her heart and crept to the side of the bed. Her grandmother, Ava, lay as thin as a bundle of twigs in the center of the bed. The gentle face was a ruin of wrinkles and crumbling chitin. At least the curse had spared her features, if not her body. The blanket that covered Ava was alchemically treated to slow the spread of the disease, but there was nothing Tiri could do to stop the scourge that was burning its way through Ava's frail body. Tiri waited at her grandmother's side, afraid to wake her, but desperate for her advice. Eventually Ava's eyes flickered open. Her face split into a wide grin. "Tiri, my love," Ava said, working a thin hand out from under the sheets to take Tiri's hand. The old woman's skin was lantern hot. "Is it done?" "Tane rests with the ancestors," Tiri said. "And his implants?" Ava's voice was thin as a reed, but her words were still clear. "Reclaimed without incident." "Good. Our resources are stretched too thin as it is. They must go to another. Ava's eyes closed briefly, and Tiri nearly laughed to let the old woman sleep. But before she could go, Ava opened her eyes again. They were bright and piercing. "What's the matter, girl?" Tiri deflated. In front of the others, she had to be Tiri the elder, Tiri the scholar, Tiri the leader. But Ava had swaddled Tiri when she was a child, comforted her when her parents died, and raised her as a daughter. There was no need for the mask. Pulling a stool closer, Tiri collapsed next to Ava's bed and let her shoulders slump. "They don't think I'm up to it," she whispered. "There are days when I think they're right. What if this was a mistake? What if we should have stayed in the sanctuary, stayed away from Cherufe? What if getting closer to him only makes the curse worse? We've already lost so many. And Tane..." Tiri swallowed, then squeezed Ava's hand. "And you. If you die out here because of a decision I made, I could never forgive myself." "I am going to die, Tiri. Here or back at the sanctuary, or somewhere far down this path. Whether I live or die is not your concern, nor your responsibility." The old woman was leaning forward, pulling at the conduits hooked into the back of her head. "I am one person. You're more than that to me." Ava's face cracked into a wizened smile. She patted Tiri's hand, then eased back onto the bed with a sigh. "You care too much, Tiri. You always have." "I thought that was why the elders chose me to lead," Tiri said. "We chose you because you are not us." Ava's voice faltered, and her eyes fluttered shut. "Tane would never have left his tower. I would much rather be in my cactus garden. The rest of the council would not have made the decision to leave. We would have stayed in our comfort and our security." "So I shouldn't have dragged you out into the wastes." Tiri stood up, nervously pacing the length of the bed. "I knew this was a mistake. I've killed us all." When Ava smiled, it was a weak and flickering thing. She tried to find Tiri's hand, but didn't have the strength and gave up. Tiri returned to her side. "We would have stayed in the sanctuary, and we would have died there. And the Aua would have died with us," Ava said quietly. "You must find what has become of Cherufe. Learn why he has returned. Contain him once again." "But how do I know I'm doing the right thing? The maps are old, and the land has changed. I thought maybe we would find reserves here, or at least shelter. But this place is nothing but burning sand and broken stone. I could be leading us in circles. What happens if—" "The Aua do not need your doubts, Tiri," Ava said, her voice barely a whisper. "They need your resolve." Before Tiri could answer, the old woman settled deeper into the bed and fell fast asleep. Afraid that she might be dying, Tiri checked the machines that were sustaining her. It was only once Ava began to snore that Tiri finally retreated. She stepped out of the tent, blinking in the sudden light and heat. The camp was alive once again, the people gathering supplies and preparing food and making ready to continue their journey. Tiri took a deep breath, smelling the desert heat and the sulphurous tang of burning flesh. Searing pain shot through Tiri's arm. She glanced down. A line of red cinders crawled across her forearm, blistering and then bursting in a jet of hot ash. Tiri clamped her hand over the wound, grimacing as the heat scalded her palm. The initial agony wore off. When she looked at it again, it had settled into a smouldering fissure, its depths glimmering with bright cinders. There was no room for doubt. If Tiri didn't leave the Aua out of the wastes, they would die here. And not just die, but fall to ash and disappear as if they had never existed. She looked around at the broken spires and blasted sand that surrounded her. This had already happened to her people once. It would not happen again. She wouldn't let it. The infamy sagged in the air. Treasure of all kinds, some of it even valuable, filled its gondolas to bursting. Gremlins and bandits drank heavily, singing songs and improvising lyrics as they became progressively more intoxicated and equally cheerful. Not Zip. Zip hung in the rigging like a rag doll, legs twisted in the ropes. A mug of strong grog balanced on his belly. He sadly poked the feather in his magnificent captain's hat. Swinging from the airship's deck, waving that cutlass around, monologuing, it was all well and good. But what was adventure and loot if you didn't have your best friend to share it with? The noodle shop in the heart of Little Kingdom was the same as it had always been. The predations of the Burning Man, the interference of the Guild, the nightmares of the Neverborn, none of that seemed to reach the peaceful depths of Tehan's Noodle Kingdom. That's why Linh Ly came here whenever she could get away from the Red Library. She felt at home in the stacks, surrounded by the library and its shelves of tomes, attended only by the other librarians and the living booklights that populated the silent halls. But she felt safe here, with a bowl of udon and a steaming pot of tea. She leaned over the noodles and breathed in deeply of the rich, earthy miso. "Oh, this is heaven in a bowl, Han. You are a man of great talent. You do me an honor," the rotund soup maker said, bowing slightly before turning to the next customer. The shop was crowded. Patrons sat shoulder to shoulder at the bar, their heads bumping against the stained paper lanterns that hung from the ceiling. Lynn slurped contentedly, her mind temporarily distracted from her appointments. "You couldn't wait for me." Duong shouldered his way next to her at the bar. He was a tall man in his mid-20s, dressed in the simple linen and laminate armor of a guard. They'd met at last year's New Year's parade, where Duong had caught Lin's eye as he marched past, and Lin found herself joining the parade to keep up with him. Lin squealed through her broth, wiping miso from her lip before throwing her arms around his shoulders. Duong chuckled as he hugged her back. "Sorry, I was hungry. I'll order another bowl for you." She looked down at the counter. The last few noodles in her soup lay in a puddle of miso. "Better make it 2 bowls." Duong placed the order, then escorted Lin to a private booth in the corner. They held hands across the table and chatted while they waited for the soups to arrive. "How are things in the guard?" Lin asked. "Seems like things have calmed down since the Burning Man went away." "They have, although other troubles always rise to fill the vacuum. Bloody Union is squeezing our roots again, trying to muscle in on the Shinzo mines. And the guildies are marching around like someone lit a firecracker in their boots." Duong shrugged muscular shoulders, his face placid. "Nothing we can't handle." "Please stay safe, Duo. I have enough on my mind without worrying about you." "I'll be fine, Lin." Duong was going to say more, but Han arrived with their meals. That led to a few moments of silence, as Lin tucked into her bowl, and Duong watched her with silent amusement. Eventually, he cracked his chopsticks open and stirred his soup. "What does my little bookworm have to worry about? Are some of the books too heavy?" "Not every problem involves picking up heavy things, Duong," Lin said. "It's nothing. Nothing I can talk about, honestly." "If you can't talk to me about it," Duong arched his brow. Lin sighed. "I have a meeting with the Oyaban after this," she said quietly. "Are you kidding?" Duong's voice dropped to an anxious hiss. "What in the 7 hells are you doing with Mizaki?" "I have no idea," Lin said, shoveling another mouthful of noodle into her mouth. She chewed thoughtfully, while Duong blinked in silent surprise. "She's been having me research the Kaiman ever since they re-emerged. There's so little information and so many questions. Perhaps it's something to do with that. All I know is I was summoned, so I'll go." "Lin, no one has seen her since the Burning Man arrived. They say—" The young guard looked around nervously. "They say she's lost her mind, that she talks to shadows and hides her face behind a dragon's mask." You know how rumors work, Duong. They grow bigger in the telling. But I have to admit I'm a little nervous. Duong reached across the table and squeezed Lin's hand. She smiled at the gesture, then peered at Duong's steaming bowl of soup. Are you going to eat that? I've lost my appetite, Duong said, pushing it away. Lin scooped it up and dug in, slurping noisily at the rich broth. You really were hungry. I forget to eat sometimes when I'm reading, Lin said. Duong shook his head. The gunfire stopped 10 minutes ago, but Mad Dog and Sue still lingered on the stoop outside the Dirt Ridge Saloon. It was the only building in town that wasn't on fire. Mad Dog tapped the ash from his cigar into the street, then side-eyed Sue. Reckon it's your turn to get him. Like hell, Brackett. I fished him out of that orphanage in Tulich last week. He spat into the street. This one's all yours. Brackett hesitated for a long moment, then stubbed out his cigar and kicked open the doors of the saloon. The interior was a charnel house. Bodies lay piled on the tables, over the banister on the stairs that led upstairs, on the piano in the corner. The bartender's head lay next to a nearly empty bottle of whiskey on the counter. The rest of them slumped against the painting of an adventurous young lady behind the bar. The only man standing was on fire. Sparks drifted from the smouldering pits of his eyes, and lines of cinder and ash crawled through the shadows of his duster. A pair of rifles lay on the counter next to him. Brackett went nervously to the man's side. Looks like you killed them all, Parker. Yeah. Even a piano player. Mm-hmm. Mad Dog looked around the room, counting bodies and weighing his next words. Why? They were guilty of something. Parker poured the rest of the bottle into a shot glass, then pulled down his scarf and threw it back. The cracked flesh of his lips hissed with steam as he swallowed. Ain't we all? It had been some time since Lin walked the halls of the Katanaka trading house. Pungent incense assaulted her nose, a mixture of sage and sandalwood, with something else laced through the smoke, fetid and dark. In her memory, the partially open main floor had been filled with the bustle of traders and smugglers, rubbing elbows with studious attendants and the silent, looming warriors who guarded the house's interests. Now the rafters disappeared in a haze of smoke. Singe marks spotted the magnificent rice paper screens that separated the space, and the lanterns hanging overhead flickered weakly against the shadows. The few servants scuttled in the corners, their faces downturned and their shoulders slumped. The inner halls of the trading house were even quieter. Warding symbols and charms hung from carved wooden panels, spanning entire hallways, obscuring the stories cut into their surfaces. Lin wrapped her owie eye closer around herself and followed the pair of guards deeper into the house. They led her on a route she'd never walked before, climbing a set of broad stairs up to the trading house's second floor. The protective patterns continued up the stairwell, carved crudely into the plaster walls. Marks of purity and cleansing stared back at Lin as she climbed the creaking steps. When they reached the top landing, they were greeted by Mars Torakaji, standing at the opposite ends of the room. Incense smoke emanating from large brass braziers swirled in gentle patterns in the air. A pair of Fusuma doors stood at the end of the hallway. The sigil of the Katanaka family had been etched into the door's cypress panels. At a word from her escort, the doors slid open, revealing the inner sanctum of Mizaki Katanaka. Lin bowed nervously, then entered. Lin Ly, a familiar voice said from within. I'm glad to see you. The Oyaban of House Katanaka sat at a low table at the far end of the room. Steam curled from a ceramic teapot, decorated with cherry blossoms, flanked by a pair of simple cups. Mizaki's black robes blended into the shadows. Only the faintest hiss of familiar yellow saffron fabric peeked out from beneath the darker material. An ornate headdress rested atop the Oyaban's head, but her lower face was hidden behind a silver mask, worked into the shape of a dragon's leering mouth. Lin bowed deeply. Oyaban Katanaka. Mizaki bowed her head in return. Come, sit. As Lin stepped into the room, she realized that the reclusive Oyabun wasn't alone. Warders sat at the sides of the chamber in deep meditation, chanting in low voices. Their voices wove into the plumes of incense, filling the air with an unsettling tension. Something bleak and predatory lurked in the shadows, kept just far enough away by whispered chants and charms. But it was there, watching and waiting. For the first time in her years of knowing Misaki, Lin felt uneasy. Ping! A small bell echoed. The unsettling presence faded at the sound, like the tide of a dark sea rushing out. The respite was brief. The pressure returned almost immediately, filling in the brushstrokes of shadow painted across the Oyabun's chambers. Lin took a deep breath, inhaling the cloying incense as she joined Misaki at the table. The Oyabun's eyes were black in the dim light, edged with the graying lines of exhaustion. "You are looking well, my Oyabun," Lin said, choosing her words carefully. Misaki didn't respond as she unfurled her wide sleeves to reach the teapot. "Just Misaki, Lin. Formalities have become a burden as of late," the Oyabun replied. She poured the hot tea into Lin's cup. The smell of lotus mixed with pungent green tea emerged, along with curls of thick steam. "But thanks are long overdue. Your research into the Kaimon has been invaluable these past weeks. The shadows of my past have quieted, for now. I am glad to have been of service. The library knows many things, and I was sure the ancestors could provide something to help." Then smiled and waited for Misaki to pour tea for herself, but the other woman never did. She hesitantly picked up her cup. The first sip immediately brought back memories. Helping work the stepped fields of her childhood, running down mountain roads, long nights reading her father's limited library. She set the cup back down and folded her hands on the table. "Hopefully we've seen the last of the burning man." Ping! "He will come back." Misaki's voice grated. Her shoulders fell and her head tilted under the weight of the mask. "I am tired. These spells are old. They have held for this long, but every time the burning man returns, I feel myself coming apart. Everything unravels. The past, the present. It gets harder to put myself back together, to find what I'm losing." Misaki's voice drifted off. She reached for the stacks of papers at her side, running a hand over the frayed edges. Beside them, a map of the little kingdom. Tiny figures rested on top. Then could spot several ornate pieces sharing space with cubes bearing kanji or carvings of animals. Another set of blocks sat nearby, freshly made. They bore the kanji for fire. One was taller than the others, made from brassy wood. Misaki picked it up, turning the column in her hand before roaring and throwing it against the wall. It shattered. The lacquer on the splinters caught the light. They looked like tongues of fire lashing out before scattering across the floor. "Loss! We are the ones losing, father." The outburst made Lin jump, spilling some of her tea over the cup's side. She let it drip, frozen while Misaki twitched like one of the warped given over to the burning man. Ping! Around her, the warders began chanting more intently. Lantern light worked its way through the smoke, briefly lighting the room. Even Lin could feel the oppressive force, threatening to bring the entire roof down upon them. It could have been minutes, or a matter of seconds, but the quasi-serenity of the room returned. Misaki gripped the sides of the table, like a drunk trying to steady herself after a long night. "Lady Misaki," Lin ventured. "Sit. I am fine." Lin realized she was standing, reaching out to the Oyabun. Gently, she lowered herself back down onto the cushion. Misaki adjusted her mask before continuing. "Yanlo and his army have benefited from your research on the Kaimon, as have our agents on Earth. Have your librarians continue to gather everything they can on the Kaimon, no matter how small. We need every advantage if we are to return these creatures to the beyond. Lin nodded. Of course, Lady Mizaki. I'm sure I can find more. The Red Library is... No. Mizaki cut Lin off, coal-black eyes unblinking. That task is for them. You have accomplished more in your first year than Haru ever did in all his time as the library's guardian. It favors you, and may reveal hidden information if you look. I want you to learn about the Burning Man. Bing! Lin's mouth went dry. The Thunders worked to keep the little kingdom as secluded as possible when the Burning Man returned. But reports told of portals spewing ichor of impossible colors, forming mouths and tentacles and teeth from bubbling flesh, before melting back into the fire. The pale blue star that appeared above Malifaux City, heralded by screams of devotion and insanity, but most of all, warnings to never read the words. Lin tried to gather her thoughts. Lady Mizaki, the library only has knowledge of the past. We would have reported anything about the Burning Man right away. Mizaki continued staring at the lantern, but spoke as though she was someplace else. Her tone was absolute, a recitation. The Library of All Things collects stories and information from the past, yes. But you have not been in Malifaux long enough to remember its origin. I helped discover the library. I was there when my father first told Yan Lo to separate our people's stories from the greater whole. That portion, our Red Library, is secure. The Burning Man has not touched those volumes, it is true, but his presence may have altered entries in the library's other sections. That's where I need you to look, Lin Ly. You must venture beyond the Red Library. Memories of the dark labyrinthine shelves of books outside the borders of the Red Library filled Lin's mind. Lin remembered spending nights there, clutching a tiny lantern. It was the only time she escaped Haru Katanaka's awful yelling. Stories brought comfort. They were Lin's family, but even the young librarian hadn't dared spend much time in the stacks. She'd always felt the library watching her, like an ancient dragon slowly rising from its slumber, curious and hungry. Lady Mizaki, we don't know what's in the other branches, Lin said hesitantly, trying to convince herself as much as the Oyabun. I've even forbidden other researchers from going too far into the stacks. Anyone who goes too far in doesn't come back. His fires are coming. It's just a matter of time. A tiny lamp caught Mizaki's eye, drawing away her words like a moth to flame. Time we do not have. Mizaki paused, gripping the edges of the table while muscles in her neck strained. Her voice grew sharp, the inflections unnatural. Do not question your Oyabun. You will fulfill your duty to the 10 Thunders. Bing! Then felt her heart pattering, startled by Mizaki's sudden harshness. The warders chanted louder. Plumes of incense clouded the air. It became nearly unbreathable, but Mizaki just closed her eyes, slipping into meditation. Whatever forceful incantations the Shinto priests used soon had the desired effect. The chant lost its urgency, fading into the background like distant thunder. When Mizaki spoke next, her tone was softer. I would never put you at risk. The 10 Thunders promised you a new life, and that is a vow I will uphold. Your connection with the library isn't like anything we've ever seen. I saw something special in you during my father's rule, but your efforts have exceeded my expectations. The library protects you, Lin. You may be the only one who can safely walk its halls. Bing! Yes, Lady Mizaki, I will do my best, she said, bowing low. Mizaki returned the gesture, eyes closed. Very well, that will be all, Mizaki said. She gestured and the sliding doors opened. Lynn stood and bowed again. The Tarakaji at the door watched her pass, blank porcelain masks in stark contrast with the room's shadows. And Lynn. The edge of Mizaki's voice sent a shiver down the librarian's spine. I expect your silence about my condition. Is that understood? You can trust me, Lady Mizaki, she said softly, forcing a smile. Good. I would hate for something unfortunate to happen to you if I ever heard otherwise. Mizaki's jet-black eyes reflected the room's candlelight, giving the Oyaban pupils of dancing flame. She held Lynn's gaze, savoring the moment, before returning to the table and her maps. Dismissed. The doors closed behind her, leaving Lynn in darkness and the smell of incense, listening to the frantic chanting of the Shinto priests.
That's it for another episode of the Breachside Broadcast. Join us next time for more Tales of Malifaux.